Good morning, and welcome to St. Paul United Church of Christ, Keokuk.
Would the children come forward and help me start the service of the Word? You come back with me again. We're going to look at a window, okay? Be sure to tap this on the way. Yeah, got to do that. Okay, when we look at this window over here, we see a star, right? Then we see the light from the star coming down, and we see two letters. They're called Chi-Rho in Greek, the first two letters of Christ's name. In the manger. Christ was born in the manger. And this tells us to keep our eyes focused on Jesus Christ. This tells us that the star came, light came into the world, and Christ came in the manger for us. And we're going to talk about how we're going to keep all of our attention focused on Jesus Christ now. Look at this. And God says, look at Jesus Christ the same way. See? See, you both looked, didn't you? Look. See? I made you look. God makes us look at Jesus Christ too, okay? All right, so remember now, tap this one. I want to see that you tap these. I don't want to get you. Go ahead, tap it. There you go. All right, that's good. Okay. All right, let's sit over here. Do you see that the days are getting longer? You see that the days are getting longer? Okay, good. And with the days getting longer, do you know what the word Lent means? This is a time in church that we have what we call Lent. That's a time of lengthening of days. That's what that word means. And it means also that we think about being good. We think about something we can do to help ourselves be better for God. All right. What's a nice thing you can do? Can you do something nice for your parents during this time? Maybe draw a picture and have something on it that says, I love you. Maybe eat your vegetables. I don't like to eat vegetables. I'll tell you right now. Beans were for another purpose, you know. It's just always been that way. But I have to eat vegetables to stay healthy. Yeah. You know what I like to eat? Chocolate. And peanut butter. Okay. Shall I give up chocolate for Lent? I can tell you I'll try. Yeah. But I'll tell you what. You think of something good that you can do for your parents. Maybe you can obey them. Maybe you can do something they tell you to do without telling you 3 times. Something like that. You can do that for Lent, okay? Think of something good. Draw a picture. Draw a nice picture. That'd be nice. Okay, so doing something good for Lent. And now I'm going to teach you a little bit how to pray again. All right? Are you ready to talk in there? All right. Oh, you're almost there, though. Okay. Let's pray together. Lord, help me to be good.
Help me to be good.
And change for you.
And change for you.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, very good. You can go back to your seat. A long time ago, there was a philosopher by the name of Heraclitus, and he said something that was very important. He said that change is always with us. It's always with us. It's always going to be with us. It's the one constant thing that everything is going to change. I once had a book called Who Moved My Cheese? We don't like change quite often, and this was about somebody who moved a mouse's cheese. And now he had to go look for it, and it wasn't something that he wanted to do because it was always there. God is always changing things in some way for us toward what's better. Toward what's better. Change is always a part of our lives if we're faithful people for God. God is always changing us to a better creation, a better love. God is always moving us to improve and moving us to live a better life. Change is everywhere. Everywhere you look, things are constantly changing. We're getting older. Politics changes. All of the things that change include the seasons, and it includes other things as well. Soon we're going to have spring, right? But it changed back to cold, didn't it? And a lot of people didn't like it that it changed back to cold as well, including me. I was already getting the garden tools out and all that sort of thing and the bulbs. And then all of a sudden, things changed back to cold and snow. Can you imagine that? My cat took one step out into the snow and lifted its foot like, really? Really? So again, change is the constant thing that we have. Change is everywhere. Changes that God brings into our lives are everywhere. Change can be a very good thing. And the Transfiguration was a change. And the disciples were heading for a change. And as we go into Lent, the word meaning lengthening of days, we are heading for a change. And we are looking to ourselves and examining ourselves, as I said in the children's sermon, to see whether or not there are things that could change, to see whether or not there are some good things that we could do. This is a time of change in which Jesus said to the disciples, I am going to die. The Son of Man is going to die. And the disciples really didn't understand what he was talking about. He was supposed to be a king who was supposed to establish rulership, and death was not part of this. But they didn't understand his sacrifice, and that he was going to be raised. They didn't understand that at the time. There were changes afoot. And in the midst of all of this talk of change, Jesus was also transfigured. Jesus was transfigured, and we see the story of that in the Scripture. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And while he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. The disciples were confronting a lot of change. Jesus was talking about death and resurrection, and then all of a sudden he was changed into bright light, and they had a lot to digest. But God wanted the focus of the disciples to be on Jesus during this time of change, because times of change are confusing. They're confusing. During times of change or times of stress in your life, for example, you might find that you put something into the refrigerator that you shouldn't have. Maybe it's your billfold or whatever, or purse, as the case may be. You may find that you actually put that little container of milk in the freezer without thinking, because things have been changing around you, and because of that, you lose things too. You just had your keys, but now you don't know where they are. In times of great change, we need to have a focus. And during this time of Lent, we need to have a focus. And God knew that the disciples would need to have a focus to get them through the time of change in order to stay on track while things were changing, while Jesus was on the cross, while they were waiting for the resurrection, because otherwise their minds would drift off and they would be scattered. What was that focus? This is my Son in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Keep your focus on Jesus Christ, because there are going to be many changes. We have to have a focus during the time in which we have changes, because it's very confusing for us. We're used to things being on a specific place. And as Kim will tell you, I have difficulty finding things anyway, even when they're right in front of my nose, and have been there for a long time. Imagine change. Imagine change. And how it's difficult to keep our focus. So during Lent, we focus on Jesus while everything is changing, just like the disciples did, because we kind of walk with the disciples. We take their walk. They had a lot of doubts, misgivings when Jesus was headed toward the cross, because they were thinking to themselves, especially after Jesus was arrested, this is a very dangerous time. This is a very dangerous time, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And we don't understand everything that's going on. And yet, they walked behind Jesus, focused on Jesus, where he went, because they needed to have that focus, because not all of the questions were being answered fast enough for them. The only thing that kept them oriented, the only thing that kept their faith together, was the idea that they could keep their eyes on Jesus, even when he was up on the cross, and even when he was in the tomb. They kept their eyes on Jesus. They kept their eyes on their faith, because there were a sea of questions around them that were not answered. They needed to have that focus in order to get through all of those unanswered questions. Jesus is standing before the rulers of the day. The religious leaders of the day want to crucify him. The disciples were expecting that Jesus would establish a kingdom in this world. Everyone was expecting that the Messiah would do that he would throw off the Roman Empire. And now it looks like he's arrested, and it looks like he's going to be condemned to death. That's a lot different than the expectations were. A sea of unanswered questions. And finally, you're left with just one thing. And that's Jesus standing there, or Jesus on the cross, or Jesus now in the tomb. And you're following and keeping your focus on Jesus, because all of these questions are unanswered, but you trust that God is going to bring you through. That God is going to bring you through. So in the Transfiguration, God left no mistake in the minds of the disciples that they were to listen to Jesus. What Jesus said was what they would focus on. Now we know in our lives that we have all kinds of unanswered questions too. And during Lent we can learn this lesson just like the disciples did. We have unanswered questions about the future. We don't know for sure what's going to happen in the future. Sometimes we have times of stress where you have all kinds of unanswered questions. But the disciples kept their focus on Jesus through the whole time. During the time that Jesus was crucified and the time that Jesus went to the tomb, and also after the resurrection. And that is what led them through that sea, that stormy sea of unanswered questions. When things change, there are a lot of unanswered questions. We're finite and we're small, and we don't know the answers to everything, and sometimes we wonder. We really do wonder. And the disciples, too, they were wondering what was going on. It was a little confusing and fearful to see this transfiguration, but they got a glimpse of what Jesus would be like after the resurrection. They got a glimpse of what life would be like. It would be full of light and bright. And they focused on Jesus to make that walk to the cross, as we also, during Lent, make that walk toward the cross. The frightening thing about that walk is that it is a dark one, and we have those unanswered questions that we look at all the time. But in the self-examination that we engage in Lent, and we often engage in when there's great change, we look at ourselves, we look at our status, we look at where we're at. In that self-examination, we can find ways in which we need to change. I talked about that to the children, ways in which we need to change. And there are many ways in which we can change. We can see when spring comes and more light comes, just as more light is coming in Lent, we can see under that light many of those little dark areas in our lives where things are just a little darker, a little more untidy than they could be. We can see those areas that we might not want to look at. In the steps for Alcoholics Anonymous, we have, for example, one step where they have to take a fearless moral inventory of themselves. A fearless and thorough moral inventory. That means they go everywhere. They look at everything. And so during Lent, we can look at everything too, because the light is coming into our lives. Let's compare it to something. Let's compare it, for example, to what happens when the light begins to fill your house in the springtime. Now, do any of you have dust bunnies in your house? Those little things where even if you vacuum, they roll ahead of you, they try to escape. Yeah, because they're round now, the dust is collected. During the springtime, we see all of those things. We see other changes and things need to be done. Any of you have leaves in your yard? That sort of thing. During the winter time, when there was a lot of snow, you brought the dog out to do whatever they do and all that sort of thing. Now, with the spring, everything's melted off, and it looks like bison have been back there. It looks like buffalo have been back there. And we need to straighten things out because, after all, we want things to look neat. Well, similar things happen in relation to our lives. There are other changes as well. We need to plant things. Things start to flower because of the coming back of the light. So there's two things that need to happen when the light comes back. I spoke of change. There's two things that need to happen. One is that we look at those things that need to be done. We clean after the buffalo that were in the backyard last winter. We chase after those dust bunnies that might be running around our house. We need to look at those things that may have been neglected in our lives. The little dust bunnies in our spiritual lives that we've been kind of not looking at for a while. We need to have a look at those. We need to pick them up and toss them away or whatever it happens to be. But the light exposes them, you see. The light exposes them. But there's another change that takes place. And this is what I always like about Easter time. And that is that you can always count on spring to kind of be there when Easter comes. And you can always kind of count on being able to do something in the garden when Easter comes and start all that sort of thing. And you see the blooms coming forth. You see, the light not only exposes all of those areas that need attention, but it also brings forth the blooming, it brings forth the births of animals, all kinds of things, and very beautiful as well. These are the kinds of things that happen during Lent, this lengthening of days. We examine ourselves and we look at beauty and wonder that comes with change. Light brings change, both in the sense that we examine ourselves because we see more things, and also in the sense that we have a great deal of beauty around us because of the light that comes into the world. I am eager to plant those bulbs, to see the various plants come up and that sort of thing. Maybe I'm less eager to look at those areas in which I've fallen short, but I need to do both. We need to clean up the yard in order for those plants to flower, that kind of thing. So then there are those two things that occur: the light bringing change, the flowers coming into the world as we examine ourselves. And we worship together as well and engage more fully in our worship because we know that it's comforting to have the fellowship of the faithful as we make that walk toward the cross. I'll take another example from Alcoholics Anonymous. There was a fellow who was going to go into what they call meetings, and he was about to go into a meeting, and he said, "I'm about to go into my own head, and I don't think I want to go in there alone." And so also, when we communicate with other people, when we have a kind of fellowship with other people, we actually do feel better. And the walk of Lent is not a walk that we take all by ourselves. It's a walk that we take in conjunction with other people. We are a fellowship. We are one body of Christ. And we comfort one another and help one another in that walk. The walk of the cross is a relatively dark walk, but it is a walk toward the light. And as we walk toward the light, then, we can talk with each other, we can worship with each other, and then in these midweek services, we can fellowship with one another at a meal, and fellowship at a meal is a great thing. I'm always ready to fellowship at a meal, as you know. You have all sorts of good things that happen when we relate to one another during the season of Lent. The fellowship becomes deeper as we examine ourselves. Because when we look at the various ways in which we perhaps have fallen short, we realize one very important thing. And this dawns upon us like the light dawns upon us in Lent in general, and that is that we need one another. Because we are not sufficient unto ourselves. We don't have the strength in and of ourselves to do everything. We need one another. We need the comfort, the conversation, the fellowship of other people. One of the things that always amazed me as I was doing substance abuse counseling was that it almost didn't matter what fellowship it was, but if people who had a substance abuse problem started to relate to other people, they began to get better. They began to get better. So they'd come to me and say, "Oh, I went to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's just a bunch of people telling their stories. I was totally bored." And I said, "Good." I said, "If you were bored, that means you were relating to other people, which is a good thing. You're probably going to get better, you know." And then you get a story, and I've heard the story many times. "Oh, I decided to help clean up the coffee after the meeting, and you know what? I didn't feel like I didn't feel like drinking at that time. And as a matter of fact, I've been sober for a long time now. Cleaning up the coffee, contributing to other people, all of those sorts of things help us to get better. And they help us also to be healthier. And so the movement of Lent is also a movement toward a fellowship which is healing, which is enhancing, which helps us to get better. I would always have a problem if somebody said, well, I just feel that everybody is bad and I just want to isolate from all these bad people. I go, well, you're not going to get too well that way. This is a fellowship time. We walk this walk of the cross together. And because of that, we engage in a kind of humility. The humility is that involved in us not being sufficient to ourselves and not being able to take all of this big change in which we examine ourselves and wait for the blooming that comes during the light. Not being able to take all of this great change without the help of other people. We are not sufficient to ourselves. This is the humility. However, the nations of the world sometimes think they can get along without that kind of humility. And so we read in the Psalm, and this is just typical of how nations can sometimes be. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off our fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. The nations of the earth want to take off all the restraints. They want to forget that they're not sufficient to themselves. They want to take off all the restraints and feel as though that they're not subject to anything higher than themselves. And what happens? The one enthroned in heaven laughs. They say, pride goeth before a fall. And in fact, here's the big problem with pride. The big problem with pride is that it makes us think we're bigger than we actually are. Now, in nature, you have things do that so that they won't get attacked. For example, a puffer fish gets real big. And animals try to look all big and bad and everything like that. Well, it makes us think, pride makes us think that we're all powerful, that nothing can touch us. And we don't realize what Jesus taught us through the cross, and that is humility makes us strong because we rely on one another. Sure, God could have made it possible for Christ to throw the Roman Empire out of Israel, to be a king sitting on a throne, but then Christ would only be that. And, as is the case with many other kingdoms, eventually that kingdom would not have the kind of growth that we have in God. We have the kind of growth we have in God because of the humility of Jesus Christ. Christ didn't sit on a throne to control people with armies. Christ didn't sit on a throne to eventually just rule lands. Christ died on the cross so that Christ could be in each one of us. And in that humility taught us to love one another and be, as a whole, bigger than each part. Christ died on the cross to show us that humility, that we mean something to each other. And in that is our strength, not that we rule over each other. Christ means something to us, and that's why Christ is in our
You have been
heart.
listening to St. Paul United Church of Christ, 2030 Plank Road, Keokuk. Join our worship service at 10 a.m. with fellowship hour immediately following. Until next week, may God bless.